Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for taking time out at a point of the year where you're at the end of a very busy tenure in your respective positions, or you're about to assume another one going into next year. I respect your service and the effort you've made to be part of this innovation discussion. I'm really glad Claire brought up the example of John Boyd, because he represents, in a military context, one of the best examples of applied innovation. For those that don't know, Boyd's thesis was set to answer the question why in the Korean War, when the F-4 Phantom was a far superior aircraft to a MiG-29, were US pilots getting shot down by Korean and in some cases Chinese pilots. Why was that happening? Technology should tell us that it should be an absolute certainty that that highly technological and superior aircraft should be able to outmaneuver and kill a MiG-29. The reason that was happening was because of the pilot and their inability to make decisions in a way that informed a learning loop and a decision cycle that allowed for both an observation, an orientation, a decision and then an action to occur in a seamless way. He expressed that as an algorithm. Okay, most people just think the Boyd cycle is a simple four-step process and they're highly critical of it, but I suggest to you those that don't understand it. It's expressed as a mathematical equation. That equation becomes the design theory for the F-15 and the F-16. Okay? The F-16 has about 1 million lines of code in it. That becomes the basis of design for the F-35A. The F-35A, in an unclassified sense, has 8.5 million lines of code, and it's a software-enabled technology, which means its growth will be exponential. So the last US Army ground combatant to face an air threat was in April 1953. They haven't faced one since. The decisions around Boyd through air combat to use and concentrate on decision loops to improve the capability of that technologically superior aircraft to blow MiG-29s out of the sky informed 70 years of air superiority through the F-15, the F-16, and will inform the F-35 Alpha, the pilots of which from the aCDF that will man that machine, most of which haven't been born yet. And so in the context of innovation, we think about innovation isn't self-evident. It doesn't just happen. And also, you don't necessarily learn from your failures. Think about the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and the failures that led to the disaster on the Eastern Front at Tannenberg and in other places in the First World War, which led to the Russian Revolution and 70-odd years of communism through the manifestation of the Soviet state. So it's not self-evident that you learn innovation as a result of failures, and innovation in the military is particularly hard to get momentum on because the military is by inclination and by design a conservative institution. It is a national icon. It was here before the nation. It may well be here after the nation. And so its ability to change in a way that mirrors technology and the pace and scale of change is the challenge that brings you here today, and I thank you for that. I'm going to talk for the next 10 minutes about what I think are some things to consider in terms of how we might fight going forwards. It is on the assumption that you accept certain Westphalian principles about the International Society of States and how that system works, and also the Clausewitzian dictum that the nature of war doesn't change, merely its character. And by nature I mean, in the words of Nathan Bedford Forrest, war means fighting and fighting means killing. And so again, as you go into your forums over the next couple of days, think about the effects we generate in the physical domain, so land, maritime and air, are mainly a process that leads at an endpoint to destruction. And potentially, as we look at the non-physical in cyber and space, albeit that is physical, albeit outer space, it may well be a focus to cause disruption. So physical domains, destruction, non-physical disruption, and then as an organising theory, you use that in an application of capability which we know out to 2026 under our own integrated investment plan, and then how to engender tactics which inform operations and strategy. Next slide, please, Claire. Okay, that's the world. You're well familiar with it. Okay, for those who are interested in strategy, and I've seen a lot of the buzzwords around strategy and culture and one trumps the other, it is absolutely the case that strategy matters. And I think when you think about geopolitics, regardless of where you sit in space and time, it's three factors. One is geography. Unless you're around when Gondwanaland broke off from Africa and sort of floated freeform across to where we are right now, geography does not change. And it informs the way that conflict manifests itself in this physical domain. Think about the Russian approach to war. It's trade space for time. Think Napoleon think about Barbarossa, it's trade space. Pull everyone onto your internal lines to use the Jominian context, okay? Get them on their external lines or their exterior lines, and then wait until you've got sufficient mass for attack. The Chinese did the same through People's Popular Warfare in the 1950 Cultural Revolution. Think about geography in the context of our own approach to defence and national security. We've had a defence in-depth approach, which has been the policy dictum throughout the 80s and 90s, albeit it's been contested. But then again, contextualise that with the most significant military disaster we've ever been a party to, which was the loss of the 8th Division in Singapore in the beginning of World War II. 14,500 Australians, half the size of a regular army, gone, because we falsely believed the Royal Navy was able to effectively fortress Australia by providing a maritime presence to our north. Wrong. But that was based on geography, and it didn't reflect the changing nature of technology and politics, okay? And the last other two aspects of strategy you need to think about, one is political ideology, because it informs how nations act and interact, and again, the Westphalian dictum is important. And the last piece is economy. It is about the means to make war, okay? So when you think about strategy and how to apply it to innovation, those three elements, geography, economy and ideology, are absolutely essential for your understanding of how this system works. As difficult as it is to believe, it is my assessment the world was far more dangerous 100 years ago than it is right now. You think about the tens of millions that were killed in that global contest in Europe, which potentially could have manifested itself far more significantly than it did. And you think about that scale in terms of the persistent conflict we live in today. The difference is the pace of change and the transformation through connectivity that makes today's conflict seem unprecedented. But I think 100 years ago, the world was in a far more dangerous place as it applied to military conflict. Next slide, thanks. Okay, this is another way of looking at the world. Now, you can see we live in that part of the global sphere in the southern hemisphere where there's less than 25% of the total population. Most of it is a maritime domain. The Antarctic space is something that we can't access, yet we have an ownership and an interest on. And again, our strategy is not defined through this geographic proximity. This slide here is to tell you to look at things differently, is to understand that, again, geography doesn't change, but it's your perception and your perspective and the context, okay? Without context, there's only text and it's just a con, okay? That you need to be able to apply when you think about the globe and how it works. Next slide, thanks. Okay, this is another way of looking at the world. 2008 was an important year in the history of humanity. More people became urbanised than those that live in agricultural rural settings. The next big war will be a contest inside a global slum. I was in Fallujah a couple of years ago. It is not an insignificant urban contested space, but it isn't big. It's about 3 or 4 suburbs equivalent in Sydney, okay? Think about fighting a war through megacities, those cities that are between 10 and 25 million people. In 1750, the global population was 750 million. Okay, by the middle of this century, it will eclipse 9 to 10 billion people. Okay, in 1750, you think of all the conflicts and military adventurism and wars and conflict that's occurred between now and then. It hasn't been in the context of a global population in excess potentially of 10 billion people. The next war will be physical, land, maritime, air, and to some degree space, and we will attempt to destroy at its endpoint in that domain. It will also be non-physical, space and cyber. We should attempt to disrupt in that space, but I think perhaps, and again, if you accept Clausewitz, war and conflict is about the imposition of will, okay, using violence, which is a form of politics. A significant area where conflict will be fought will be between your ears, and those are the communities you belong to, and that needs to be accepted no more as dogma, but as an absolute truism of future conflict, okay? You will live the proverbial 3-block war, which was espoused by the Marine Corps in the mid-80s, that there will be peace, conflict and war within 500 metres of each other on every suburban urban block that you'll be fighting through in the context of achieving your tactical or operational outcome. That's an organising theory, and this is why we need it. Ordering principles, how to apply military effect, and so on and so forth. That will not change. whether technology enables our military force to be competitive in an offset or an asymmetric sense against forces that are much larger. And as Stalin said, you know, quantity is a quality all of its own, but we will never out-brigade the regional forces that exist in the Southeast Asia, Southwest Pacific. So we will need to use technology in the context or through the golden thread of logic that is an organising principle, a theory of war, to apply our innovation and our theory. And talking to the Forces Commander a couple of days ago about innovation that we run inside the Army, it is absolutely true we're on a growth path, but it's also true that the most important innovation that we seek is that which we can apply, okay? So if you're changing something from happy to glad on a current technology, that's an adaptation. To me, an innovation through an entrepreneurial sort of framework is not doing the same thing differently, it's doing something different, okay? So we're not enhancing something, we are disrupting and we are changing our methodology to achieve something different, albeit it sits within the confines of an organising theory by which we all agree. Just one other point on hypertransformation, and I meant to include this in the last slide, so I'll just offer this, about the war between your ears and those of your communities. Throughout the last decade, Nigeria went from 30,000 mobile phones to 116 million. Okay, and I use Nigeria specifically because they have an insurgent threat at the moment, Boko Haram. And for those of you that understand what Boko Haram literally translates into in English, it is we who reject Western education. So in a country facing an Islamic insurgency, which rejects everything Western, you've seen a proliferation of that technology which has been exponential. In Iraq and Syria, same thing, 50 to 100,000 mobile phones in 2011, okay? 14 million in Syria, 13 million in Iraq today. That contest across the physical domains, which we seek destruction, the non-physical, which we seek disruption, and the bit between your ears and that human part of the contest is one of the key things we need to start focusing on. And I'm glad to see that you guys are contemplating that. Okay, next slide. I mentioned before the point about offset strategies and the requirement for us as a relatively modest and small force in an economy and a nation that seeks to invest only so much on its defence, for us to understand how we achieve overmatch relative to our tactics, our operations and our strategy. And again, don't ever confuse tactics and operations with strategy, or you end up doing what the Germans did in 1939, where they thought an operation or a tactic could overmatch or outweigh their poor understanding of strategy. In an aDF the size of ours, it is about, I believe, relative superiority. And so again, I think about the F-35. I think about that platform, and I'm not from the Air Force obviously, but I understand what this technology affords us. This will be the first field of capability that is built based on software. The system is built on software. So it doesn't exist, it's code, okay? Hardware has physical structural limitations to it. You can build something, you can upgrade it, it reaches life of type, you've got to replace it, okay? F-35 is a software system, which means its potential for growth is exponential, okay? In an F-16 and F-18, the pilot has to weaponeer, got to do sensor management, got to talk to the supported force, got to talk to the headquarters, has to do all that and then worry about tactics. In an F-35, weaponeering's done. Sensor management is done, okay? The life support system of the aircraft is done. The pilot is liberated through technology and innovation and is able to concentrate on the two things that matter most, tactics and the human-to-human component of their mission, which is talking to a ground force commander or understanding what the high headquarters wants. That's what the pilot's there to do. That's what the soft tissue brings to this aircraft. And a system like that, when you think about future subsurface capabilities and for land, future vehicles, autonomous and so on and so forth, is something worth bearing about. Because again, if you accept Clausewitz and you accept Bedford Forrest, and fighting means killing, the human-to-human contest is what we're seeking to preserve and understand, and we're going to enable that through technology. F-35 is built for software, it's not built for hardware, and it will represent an epoch, I think, in how we manage capability and how we enable humans to fight in a contested, crowded, collective, urban, lethal space going forward. Just the other thing about the 35, and for those who understand what Skunk Works, Softworks, DiggerWorks seek to do throughout their various programs, when Northrop Grumman sat down with pilots to design the 35 cockpit, and I did this with F-22 as well, the discussion was originally around sticks and throttles and other aspects of traditional cockpit design. They threw all that out, and the organising principle of the cockpit is a 20 by 8 inch iPad-looking screen. Okay, so it's built around something that people intuitively and in a tactile way already understand. That system, that cockpit is structured in that way. All of the head-up display is now inside the helmet. You've got a bunch of cameras that point back at your eyes and follow your retina. And so all of the design and decision-making is happening inside the helmet. So you are free to look around, weaponeer, be able to, again, talk to your supported force without necessarily worrying about what your hands are doing, albeit they're a joystick and a throttle. That's a design principle, again, going forward in future conflict, which we need to leverage off. And that's where innovation starts to get to that point where you're not doing the same thing differently, you're doing something different. Okay, and that's the context by which I'd offer you. Next slide, thanks. Okay, this is a vision of future warfare. There'll be some slides shortly that speak to, again, an applied approach to innovation where I think it's important to understand that everything needs to have relevance as we move forward. But what I would say is that the human-to-human interface, the man-machine team, whatever you want to call it, I think is at the corner of the realm, okay, for future warfare. It is absolutely the case that in democracies such as ours, in future warfare, where there will be wars of necessity, potentially wars of survival and wars of choice, that the human-to-machine interface is going to be the critical aspect that fuses and binds our process together. And again, think about the physical, the non-physical domains, and how we seek to sort of come up with a symbiotic relationship where we have destruction as a focus and disruption as another. But I think, again, that tethered to, for example, a cavalry squadron, tethered to long-range fires, potentially obviates, in most instances, the need for soft tissue to go and clear and hold ground, okay? That's innovation in the same way that you're doing something different, you're not doing the same thing differently. Next slide. For those in uniform who are interested, I would offer that the unified domain approach, again, is the essence of future warfare. Air Force have a project 6500 which speaks to that. The Land Force intuitively understands it through some of its land combat systems, but unifying and applying our terminal effects through an all-sensor, zero-latency domain is the future of warfare. So if you can reduce the latency, or the lag, if you like, between the steps of the aCDF targeting cycle, which I know you all know, 6 steps, everyone know it? Yeah? That is the mechanism by, again, which we achieve that MUM-T or H human-to-human contact to achieve that zero latency, because again, we're about putting people in a position where they can make superior decisions to achieve that relative superiority, which is about having overwhelming force at points at a pre-planned point and time and place to achieve your mission, regardless in certain circumstances to the size of the adversary. But 6500 and the unified domain warfare is certainly what we're looking to focus on. Does anyone know what that is or where it is? No? Sorry?
Is it hypersonic?
Yeah, no, it's the Woomera rocket test range. Okay. The KN-08 missile, okay, it's one of North Korea's finest. It potentially is being weaponised to a point where it can have a 12.5 to 18,000 kilometre range, which could hit the west coast of the US, potentially could hit Northern Australia, and presents an old new threat, given that this technology has been around a long time, but it's, again, the policy, the resources, and the mandate of a certain despot in North Asia makes this a real threat. The Australian countermeasure for this at the moment is the... Anyone? ANZUS Treaty. Okay, we measure that, we manage that through our alliance. When you think about the trillions of dollars of defence benefit that we achieve through that relationship, I would reaffirm to you that alliance management as we go forward, and you extrapolate this to include defence industry, innovation, foreign military sales, the ability to make war, that is a large element of what we need to do through the processes of elimination, of innovation, and hopefully innovation of that threat. The global system that I predict will occur probably in the next 30 years, where you can immediately, through fissile intelligence and other means, identify a launch and have the means to vector and interrupt or interdict that target, will be something that occurs within our lifetime. That's the fusion, if you like, between operations and strategy. The ability to have that global system where if you look at the US Marine Corps single battle theory, okay, an action anywhere has effects everywhere. This is potentially what will be the technology driver that forces us to think about our operations and how we make war across a global context where the threat includes the ability of a rogue nation to target our major cities, by which beyond the alliance we actually have no conventional countermeasure. That's the environment which we're currently existing in. And I don't want to be alarmist, but it is, you know, through the law of thermodynamics, that is a physical actuality right now, which we seek to manage, I think, through our alliance framework. Yep. Okay, 3 more slides, and they're very busy, but I would offer these to you going forward. And this isn't about today. This is about what you do back in your respective organisations and across the innovation adaptation professional alliance. I have used this in my mind as an ordering principle to have a think about what I think we need to innovate towards. Again, as General McLaughlin would constantly reaffirm, innovation is great, applied innovation is what we're interested in. How we apply this to the military effect is critical to what we do, because it is not self-evident that this just happens, and we are not here to impress each other with our innovation credentials unless it's through the prism of how to make war or how to improve capability. We'll go next slide, thanks. Okay, a lot there. I'll just skip down. So I've actually stepped these out 3 years. So for those of you that are planning on being a CDF, I'd offer these slides to you, and maybe in 2048 you can execute. So you move down there. I've talked from everything about cross-cultural recruitment, approach to workforce, the insertion of future technologies, common operating environments, digitising the CH-47 Foxtrot, the inclusion of ground-based air defence capabilities. And again, April 1953, last time the Americans were ever attacked from the air, would tell you and give you insight as to why potentially GBAT is becoming so much more important, because I think to some degree we've forgotten about that air-ground unified domain concept. Next slide. That's out to 27. Okay, high definition full motion video through manned and unmanned systems. I mean, the US were doing that 10 years ago, so perhaps by 2030 we can modernise to 2015, which would be fantastic. And then out to 48, talked about aerial ISR, and then through future tanks and so on and so forth. Yep. So ladies and gentlemen, I'll pause there. I understand you've all got 15 to 20 years of experience. I know many of you have been deployed in operations, some of you haven't. It's not a hierarchy or a caste system. It's just to acknowledge the experience in the room. But warfare 100 years from now will still involve people trying to kill each other with their bare hands, okay? It's been the case since the first Homo sapien picked up a club. It will be the case forevermore. War is about killing human beings with your bare hands, and you work along your capability spectrum according to that. The organising principle in the context of Westphalia and Clausewitz is that you are doing that on behalf of the nation state. That's the ordering principle. That will not change as long as the international system works and that we recognise it and behave accordingly. What makes us different from just chaotic violence is that notion that we are fighting on behalf of our nation. We are engaged in a struggle that involves the taking of other human life, and cheating is absolutely appropriate, and being devious is absolutely appropriate, albeit within an ethical context. And that's my segue for Dean to give his presentation. Thanks very much.